So last week, or a couple weeks ago, I guess now, I was sworn in for my third term. I'll actually be the third longest serving mayor in St. Paul's history, unless I get thrown out in the next year or two. But at my inaugural address, I did something that was about the dumbest thing that an elected official, particularly a mayor, can do. I asked to be held accountable. And worse than that, I asked to be held accountable for something that is really hard to achieve, that I don't control all the pieces of, but that I think is as fundamental to our city as anything else that we could possibly do, and that is to close the achievement gap, the opportunity gap, to create the kind of city for all that St. Paul is for some. So even though in your minds, if you haven't been to St. Paul, all you can think of is icicles and people frozen with their tongues to flagpoles and those kinds of things, that rarely happens anymore. It's basic cognitive skill learning in kindergarten. Do not stick your tongue on the flagpole when it's below 30 and below. But mostly St. Paul is a really wonderful community. It's not quite Garrison Keillor's, all the men are strong, all the women are good looking, and all the children are about average. But we like to think that that's pretty true. And so when I became mayor 8 years ago, we really started to go to work on from our perspective, what we could do to close the achievement gap in the city of St. Paul. And I started off actually even during the campaign, after my election, but before I was sworn in, asking the question, what is it specifically that you want the city to do? I think it's evolving over the last 8 years or so, and even a little bit before that, where the previous answer when people asked mayors what they were going to do about education was, well, I don't control the school district, and that was kind of the end of the conversation. But even for those of us that don't have control over the school district, that is just now the beginning of the conversation. And for the last 2 or 3 days at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the amount of energy that was devoted specifically to the question in and around the achievement gap, I think exceeded transportation, exceeded marketplace fairness, and a lot of other issues. Because every one of us, I think, is understanding the imperative that we face. That it is no longer just kind of a moral issue, that we have this achievement gap, this opportunity gap. It is a real threat to all of our economies. It's a threat to the stability of our communities. And it's incredibly important that we do that. I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can because I know we have a lot more to hear and a lot of discussion. But some of the challenges that we faced as we set off on our work in the city of St. Paul started off with this kind of recognition by some studies that children by the age of 12, if you're in an upper income bracket, you're a middle class kid, particularly if you're a white middle class kid, by the time you're 12, you have 6,000 hours more out of school learning, after school learning. There's so much evidence that the achievement gap can be attributed to a great deal on summer learning loss because upper income kids are going off to camps and they're going out to all these enriching experiences after school. They're doing all these things where lower income kids and kids of color aren't doing nearly those many programs, and so you have a huge summer learning loss valued at over $100,000. It's incredibly one of the things I've learned as I've gone in through this process is just how many obstacles and how many barriers are in the ways of ultimately kids succeeding. And so part of the work is just kind of breaking down piece by piece. I call them my top 20 single most important things that we have to do to close the achievement gap, because the reality of this, we have to do all of them. Obviously it starts with strong schools, it starts with great teachers, it starts with great principals and administrators, but the reality of it is there's so much that we can be doing in our communities. Between the time I was elected in 05 and the time I was sworn in, beginning of 06, I had a large gathering of community providers, of neighbors, of parents, of teachers, and really asked the question, what is it that the city has to be involved in? And the consensus was, take the out-of-school time space. Let us as the school district, let us as teachers really focus in on improving quality of education in the classroom. But our kids spend 20% of their time in the classroom, and 80% of their time outside the classroom. there has to clearly be a lot of support out there, and the city can play a significant role. So we started with an out-of-school time commission, really brought people together. We had a lot of support, first of all, from the National League of Cities, of which I'm proud to be the president of this year. We have our first vice president, Ralph Becker from Salt Lake, is with us here today. But the technical assistance that the Institute for Youth Education and Families from the National League of Cities provided for us was absolutely essential. Certainly helped build and strengthen relationships that we had with the Mott Foundation and the Wallace Foundation to really add some additional firepower for us, and that's been great. The Out of School Time Commission, after a couple of years, evolved into something we call the Sprockets program. Sprockets is a name that I've never understood. But one of the things that we learned from looking at Hartford was that these out-of-school time programs have to be owned by the children. They have to really feel like it's their program and not just an extension of the adult world. And so we went out and said, well, what name do you want to call it? We tested a lot of different names, and damn kids, they picked Sprockets. I don't know. You can't trust children. I don't know. But one of the things that we tried to do was to do something that a small component of cities that are working on this have done, which is to really work on 4 critical areas all at the same time. Really 4 key strategies that we're working on. The first one is leadership. We're really trying to engage the superintendent of the school district. We're engaging the funding community early on. We're talking to all of the out-of-school time providers, all the people that are providing summer learning for children, and really asking them to come to the table and say, okay, we have to be combined. We have to have our forces joined together. We have to have a clear kind of understanding what our roles and responsibilities are going to be. Quality is the second component. If we're just sending kids off to programs that really parents don't know whether they are just kind of babysitting or if they're actually engaging and learning, if there's any kind of alignment between the curriculum in school and what's happening in their school time program, it is absolutely essential that we have quality as an absolute, but then a real way to measure that, and that is absolutely critical. Data, just gathering information, who's out there, how they're accessing it, how we link that data, how we can share that data, how we can break down barriers on data privacy issues so that the schools can know what's happening in the out-of-school time area, how we can know what's happening in the schools, and coordinate that and help really kind of make sure that we're targeting the resources to the children that are in need and targeting the right resources, absolutely one of the tenets of this. And of course, access is, we are finding that just too many of our children don't really have access to quality school time programming. And so we're continuing to build the network out to make this happen. I should mention that the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, are engaged in a Sprocket, or not Sprockets, but a Strive-like effort that is called Generation Next. Mayor Rybeck, the now former mayor of Minneapolis, is leading that effort now as we go forward. He just took that over as mayor. In fact, this is how hard it is. The guy wasn't on the job more than 2 days, then he had a heart attack. So he's fine. I thought it was a joke, but RT would actually appreciate that joke. But he's good now. He's been out here. But the fact of the matter is, this is an issue that we're seeing across the region, and we're understanding it as a regional issue. We're understanding it as a regional competitiveness issue. We have 20 Fortune 500 companies in the Twin Cities. The leadership of this Generation Next effort is really coming out of the corporate sector, as well as the president of the University of Minnesota, Kim Nelson from General Mills, because they just said, look, we got to do something differently. And so what's heartening is that in almost every conversation I've been in with business leaders in the community, they've said, what's going on? How are we going to deal with this achievement gap? What do we have to do? One of the things that we learned early on was just transportation barriers to getting kids to these out-of-school time programs were really significant. We had a group of moms over on the west side of the city of St. Paul that early on started a circulator system that created access to programs that kids were otherwise not able to get to. So picking them up after school, moving them down to the library, moving them over to a Boys and Girls Club, a faith-based organization, those things continue to be a challenge. Funding for those kinds of things tends to be a huge challenge, and yet we know it is a primary barrier for kids participating in quality out of school time programs. It's just simply how do you get there and how do you get home once you're there. So we're fully 2 years into Sprockets. We've really collected a lot of data. We have about 2/3 of our organizations in the city of St. Paul that are providing services for youth have submitted data. We're tracking right now in our system about 7,500 youth. We need to expand that, but that's a pretty good sample size so that we're really starting to understand how kids are accessing and where they're accessing and what the results of those are. Our next step in 2014 is to merge community education data with the data that we already have. I think that will give us a really good picture of the after-school coverage and the kind of the penetration that we have of it. It's going to answer questions like how many youth are attending, are they attending a sufficient number of days to make a difference. It's kind of the dose and the frequency of the application of the dose of after-school time programming. We want to know where we're falling short, where we're not providing either enough opportunities or the right kind of opportunities, where it's not accessible. Are there certain neighborhoods that there are just kind of holes in coverage for our children? Ultimately, the goal is to have every child in the city of St. Paul to have access to these quality out-of-school time programs and to make sure that we're able to track it. It's been very cost effective. I have to say partly because we've had strong foundation support. Mott and Wallace, or the Kellogg and the Wallace Foundations rather in this instance, have supported the program. The total costs for 2013 were just short of $1 million, about $963,000. That's a small price to pay if you're doing the right things to actually make a difference. The actual city participation in that was about $127,000, mostly of staff costs to help coordinate that. About $200,000 of that has been on the data system, and 25% of that cost is the cost of the actual system to get it up and running, to buy all of the hardware that we need to get that going. There's so many different pieces, and I want to kind of short circuit this a little bit. One of the things that we are really understanding is that in our programs, like at the libraries and at the rec centers, we have to have professional development. We have to have those staff understand fundamentally that being a rec center director is no longer just making sure that the floors are swept or that there's a basketball out in the basketball court, but that they have knowledge about specific kind of childhood development strategies, that they understand the curriculum in the school and how to align that. They understand kind of behavioral issues and how to really, it's not sufficient anymore just to kick kids out of rec centers because they cause trouble. And that's the old story. And we, quite frankly, we're doing it in schools. And I think I was really proud that the president stood up a couple of weeks ago and said, let's stop sending kids to the police department when they should just be sent to the principal's office, and let's deal with some of these things inside the school district. And I think that same attitude has to happen in our libraries and our rec centers to say, all right, just because there's been an issue, the worst thing that we can do is tell that kid they're no longer welcome at the library or no longer welcome at the rec center. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead because I want to talk a little bit about this component, which I'm getting obsessed with, and partly because I've been reading this book on the airplane on the way out called How Children Succeed by Paul Tough. And it is really about this component. It's hard because we want to measure things and we want to say we have, our test scores have gone up 12%, or our first grade, third grade math scores have gone up X, or we have this many number of kids participating in programs. But there's so much evidence mounting that these non-cognitive, if you will, these life skills are so critical to a child succeeding. That measuring a child's IQ will tell you one thing, but it won't tell you whether they're going to be successful. What will really tell you whether they're successful is whether they have the resiliency to overcome challenges in their life, the crises that they see in their housing, or in their homes on a daily basis, the challenges that they see as they kind of go out and confront things in their neighborhoods or in their schools, One example of that, KIPP Academies, which do tremendous work, and we're really successful in getting kids through college, or through high school and into college. The research showed, at least early on, that those KIPP kids were struggling mightily when they got to college, and the dropout rates for KIPP kids, even though they were very successful getting into college, the dropout rates were just as significant as the non-KIPP children under certain circumstances. And they realized that this cognitive skill, or the non-cognitive, this executive functioning, the resiliency pieces of it, were absolutely essential. And so we're looking to figure out how we can incorporate these into our out-of-school time programs. Obviously, some of these things are kind of self-evident. I'm a big proponent of getting kids outside, getting them into nature in any way, shape, or form. That could be down the block in your park, or it could be a program like I've sponsored over the last 3 or 4 years, getting kids out to Glacier National Park to hike in the scariest thing that they could ever imagine, which is the wilderness. Even those kids that see or hear violence or see gunshots, hear gunshots in their neighborhoods on a regular basis. But when they go out into the woods, their confidence and their skill levels, their ability to succeed is absolutely stunning. Part of that, why I'm such a believer in it, I went to Outward Bound when I was graduated from high school, and the history of Outward Bound was that after World War II, and they started looking at the data of who survived war, particularly who survived if a ship was struck and people went into the ocean. They looked at who survived and who didn't, and it wasn't the young and the healthy that were surviving. Quite frankly, it was the older, less healthy veterans that were surviving. And what they really realized is that it was just a sheer determination and an understanding of what lie ahead that allowed them to survive. And so that was kind of a theory behind Outward Bound. And I think it's got to be a theory behind how when we look at our kids and how we're going to help them be successful, not just to get through high school, but in life. We need to give them a vision of what the future looks like, give them a vision of what the reward for sitting through boring math classes and tough school assignments is. And so we're going to continue to work on that. We have using, and this is where I'm deeply out of it, why I thank God I have really smart people that work for me to understand the relationship of all these measures, but using the survey of after-school youth outcomes to kind of determine the social emotional components of the programs is important. Measuring that whether a child is getting connected to a caring adult, which we are increasingly understanding the importance of. Whether a child, particularly in high school, has kind of initiative, their own ability to self-motivate themselves. Just that kind of motivation to succeed it just can't be underestimated. And so we can drill these kids on math tests and we can drill these kids on reading, but at some point they have to have these additional skill sets and these self-motivating things. Again, just skipping ahead a little bit. What we really have tried to do is just change how the city of St. Paul is serving our youth and how we view the roles and responsibilities of those people in whatever capacity that have contact with our youth ultimately are engaging them, whether they have the skill set. We are in the process of building a new facility over on the east side of St. Paul, one of the most historically distressed neighborhoods. It is a combined library and recreation center. But from the very beginning of that center, and the very beginning of the planning of that center, we have asked the question, how are these two organizations going to work together as one to provide a full range of services for our children? How are we going to view that not as a rec center or a library, but a center of education, a center of learning, and quite frankly, a center of hope for our children in that neighborhood? And it will open this spring. But the work has been in progress for quite a while, and I think it's going to be a very good example of how, when you can build these things from the ground up, knowing what we know now, based on the research that we have, how you really create the kind of programs that are meaningful and intentional. I'm going to just one last thing that I want to touch on, and it's the third rail, and that's the racial inequality component. It is the institutionalized discrimination, It is all of the structures that we have put in place that make it very, unintended, but quite frankly, just as troubling as any intentional discrimination. The reality is, in the city of St. Paul, who was in our schools switched completely in a very, less than a decade. Went from 85% white to 15% and 15% people of color, or thereabouts, to about 15% whites and 85% people of color. And it was a dramatic shift. So think about, we've been a city for over 150 years. We had institutions that were all designed for one kind of group of kids, and all of a sudden, we have kids speaking 100 different languages. We have all of the, challenges of poverty and race and everything else. And so, the disciplinary processes and procedures that we had, in 1950 are no longer the procedures and processes that we should have in 2014. It's hard. This is tough work. We've been working with Pacific Education Group. Our schools district has been doing it to really kind of address those kind of institutional practices, to look and see how we need to adjust and to change those things. We need to make sure that our staff is culturally sensitive, that they can relate. So that tells us that we have to hire people that look like the children that we're serving, that we have to kind of go beyond, just saying, well, you were once in a gang, so therefore we're never going to hire you, because the reality of it is sometimes those are the kids that can most relate to the children that are coming into our centers. But it is, this is a topic in and of itself that we could go on and on, but I won't, because we have more to talk about. I hope you can, if nothing else from this, you can hopefully sense I am deeply committed and deeply passionate about this work. And it is, at the end of the day, as I said in my inaugural address, this measuring rod that we place before us is done so not because it's going to be easy, but because if we don't do this, all the bricks and mortar projects that we do, all the shiny objects that we create in our community are really going to be insignificant, because 10 years from now, 20 years from now, today, we need to change what's happening for our children in our communities. Thank you.